Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to this event entitled Capitalism Can't Save Us, How Marxist Economics Explains Today's Crisis, with socialist economist Michael Roberts. To introduce myself, I'm Matt Wilgress from Arise, a festival of ideas. Thank you to everyone joining us today from across Britain and indeed across the world as we kick off our new monthly Marx Matters event series, which will take place online the first Sunday of every month at 3 p.m. And the next one will feature our good friend Paul LeBlanc talking on from Marx to Lenin to today and tomorrow in October. Marx Matters is a new series of in-person and online talks from prominent socialists exploring the relevance of Marx's work today. You can buy a ticket to help fund the whole series at a link provided in the chat. And please do let us know also where you're tuning in from in the chat. Take a look at the links provided by our volunteers and put in your questions and comments. The legendary Labour movement figure Nye Bevan once said that Marxist ideas, and I quote, put into the hands of the working class movement the most complete blueprints for political action the world has ever seen. And this series, at a time of great crises, is designed to give socialists taking up struggle today a deeper understanding of the tools that Marx, and indeed his comrade Engels, gave activists to understand the political, economic and social world around them and how to advance the cause of humanity today. Our speaker for this first session in the series is Michael Roberts, who is a good friend of Arise Festival, and many of you would have seen speaking before. Michael worked in the City of London as an economist for over 40 years, and therefore has closely observed the machinations of global capitalism from within the dragon's den, it says on his website. At the same time, he's been a political activist in our labour movement for decades and has written several books I would recommend, including The Great Recession, a Marxist View, The Long Depression, and a particular favourite of mine, Marx 200, a review of Marx's economics. Here and globally, as I've mentioned, the crisis is deepening. So it's great to have Michael join us to discuss how Marxist ideas can help us understand what is happening and what can be done about it. Over to you, comrade.
Well, thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody who is watching. It's very good that I'm able to launch these new series of sessions on socialism and Marxism and what is happening in the world. To do that, I'm just going to give you a few slides because I usually do. Michael Roberts loves his slides. So I'll be just sharing with you a few slides, which I hope will explain how I see this working out in terms of Marx's relation to what's happening in the world economy at the moment. See if I can get the right one. Okay, so why does Marx matter? Well, I think I want to bring into your minds, first of all, the crisis or the really terrible situations developing in the world at the moment for humanity, and not just for humanity, but also for the other species in the world and the planet itself. We're in what some people have called, I think, effectively a polycrisis at the moment as we go into this third decade of the 21st century. We have severe inequality between countries, between the poor countries of the global south and the richer countries of the global north. But even in the richer countries of the global north, we have considerable inequality between the majority of us and a very small elite, which have a huge amount of wealth and income compared to the rest of us per person. And at the same time, we have inequality expresses also the severe poverty which exists around the world. And I'll give you some brief data on that, just to give you the picture of how things have gone and how things are still so bad now, some 160 years since Marx first started to develop his ideas as a critique of the capitalist economy. One of the other components of the polycrisis is a new one for the 21st century, the massive increase in global warming around the world as a result of industrialization, fossil fuel production and use. And this is changing the climate increasingly quickly. So we're having extra high temperatures appearing around the world and globally emissions of carbon dioxide rising to damage the world's atmosphere. And we'd have to say in the last couple of decades in particular, we're seeing rising geopolitical conflict with wars and confrontations developing around the world in the most horrific way that we haven't seen for some time since the Second World War. Global poverty is still with us. It's estimated that 2.7 billion people out of the approximately 7 to 8 billion people existing on Earth at the moment who can't cover their basic needs for a month. And nearly a billion can't even survive for a week if they have no income at all. So they have basically no savings and no safety protection if things go wrong. Even if we include China, where there's been a dramatic improvement in reductions of poverty and the poor people in the country, there are still 3.65 billion people on the planet who earn less than $6.85 a day. So that's an indication, according to the World Bank, of how severe poverty is. And remember, the World Bank setting a very low figure here, $6.85, as their opinion is anything, if you earn more than that in a day, then you're not poor. And against that, we have the global inequality of wealth. The richest 85 people in the world are worth more than the poorest 3.5 billion. The richest 85 people are worth more in their wealth, personal wealth, than the poorest 3.5 billion. And in fact, if you look on the pyramid on the right, you will see that nearly 3 billion people, which is about 53% of the world's population, have virtually no wealth whatsoever at all. And if you were to ask yourself, where do I fit into that pyramid? Well, the vast majority of people watching this and discussing this session today will be up here in this group here, the top 10% or so. That shows how poor the rest of the world is. When you consider you're nowhere near being wealthy and rich, that's relative to everybody else, you certainly are. And of course, there are people who are way, way richer than we are. As I say, with 85 people having as much wealth as 3.5 billion, and the top 0.0001% of people have wealth equivalent to $3.1 trillion out of the $146 trillion in household wealth there was at the end of last year. And you know who they are. The usual suspects are on your right there. And you can see how quickly, in the case of the US, that inequality is expanding and wealth is tripling and accelerating for these very, very rich people. At the same time, we have the question of climate crisis and global warming. Last year, 2024, was the hottest ever seen in records as far as we can develop them. You can see on the right-hand side scale, the increase in surface temperature has been taking place particularly since the 60s. Also, we've now reached a point where we're over the Paris target. Back in 2017, the Paris Conference on Climate set a target not to be exceeded of 1.5 degrees centigrade above the average of the temperatures pre-industrial development. Now it's on 1.5 or 1.6. So we've already exceeded that within 10 years with no prospect of it going down whatsoever over the next 10 years. In fact, if anything, it's accelerating at the moment. It's becoming too hot to live already for 1.8 billion people. 90% of the South Asian population are going to be exposed to temperatures which are dangerous to their health by the end of this decade. Countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka are already finding it too hot for safe outdoor work for 6 hours in every day. And over 60% of households and firms in that region have experienced extreme weather in the last 5 years, whether it's drought, whether it's floods, whether it's excessive heat, and so on. And this situation is going to deteriorate. More and more people are going to be exposed to conditions which will either kill them or deliver a really bad situation in terms of their health. At the same time, capitalism is expanding. It's one thing that we don't want them to do, which is expanding the level of conflict and wars around the world. Here's a graph which shows state-based conflicts. That's capitalist states in conflict since 1946. And you can see that apart from civil wars, which is the red bit, foreign states having conflicts within their country, we also have a massive amount of wars and conflicts taking place between states, including whether it's between countries, imperialist countries that control the poorer countries that they have turned into colonies, or it's outright rivalry in the world. You see that figure has now reached a record level as we go into the 21st century and onwards. We have a position where, for example, the depth and strength of US military expenditure. This year, Trump is going to spend $1 trillion on military expenditure in just 1 year. And the level of US military activity around the world has reached extreme proportions. We've seen millions, hundreds of thousands of people being killed in various wars conducted by the US military in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And of course, we see this horrendous situation in Gaza at the moment as a result of support for the Israelis in their activities in the Gaza region. And of course, the war continues without end, it would seem, in Ukraine and other parts of the world that people aren't aware of. This is the result, Marxists would say, as a result of the development of capitalist production, of imperialism, and flowing from that is the war. Capitalism also is oppressive. Here are international rates of incarceration per 100,000 people, as conducted by a project. And you can see the United States has the highest level of incarceration per 100,000 of the major economies in the world. So the great economy and country of democracy actually has the highest level of people imprisoned as a whole. Why is all this like this? Why is it all like this? And why is it getting worse? Well, the Marxist view is that there's a fundamental contradiction between the development of an economy towards meeting people's needs, whether it's in their incomes, whether it's in their services, whether it's in their health and life expectancy, whether it's in their education. There's a fundamental contradiction between those social needs and capitalist production for private profit. Capitalism doesn't deliver any of those things unless it is profitable. And if it's not profitable, then you do not get them. So the fundamental contradiction in capitalism is the incompatibility between the productive developments of society and the contradictions which rise because it's a production system for profit on the one hand and the creation of wealth for the producers and not for the majority of the population as a whole. And Marx, in his works, particularly in Capital, outlines how that contradiction pans out over the course of the last 100 years and beyond. There's a limitation on the ability of capitalist mode of production to expand because there's a tendency for the profitability of capitalist production to fall over time. And at a certain point, that comes into conflict with the development of the productivity of labor, which will enable us to meet the extra services we need as the population expands or to raise our living standards. And that conflict between profitability and productivity leads to constant crises of booms and slumps in the capitalist economy. So things do not move forward harmoniously to meet people's needs. There's a continual period of boom, then slump, and basically inequalities get worse. We now see the impact that it's had on the climate and upon the planet and ecology. And this situation is continuing to get worse, and nothing is going to be done until the capitalist system is replaced. That is the Marxist argument. So Marxists are arguing that cycles of boom and slump are endemic to capitalism. They will continue indefinitely until capitalist mode of production, that is production for profit, investment for profit, not for social need. While majority view, if you read your mainstream media, is that when things go wrong, they're caused by bad policy or by reckless activities by individuals or companies or so on, or by wars or natural disasters which have nothing to do with the nature of capitalist production itself, selling things on the market for a profit. Marx's position is precisely the opposite, that crises are endemic to capitalism. And moreover, the argument of this falling rate of profit becomes increasingly compelling as an explanation of why we have crises. Here is the position of the rate of profits going back to 1950, so basically 75 years. This is the average rate of profit for the top 7 capitalist economies, weighted out. And you can see that there are periods, on the whole, there's a general decline in the rate of profit. That means it's increasingly difficult for capitalism to expand investment, to expand employment, expand production, because the profitability of doing so is declining over a period of time. Not a straight line. There are periods when the rate of profit improves, but on the whole, there's a long-term decline. And when there's a big drop, then you get slumps like in 1974-5, 1980, and then in Great Recession of 2008, and then the recent pandemic slump of 2020. So this is the, if you like, the outcome of this contradiction between profitability and productivity, and the fact that capital is controlled by just a small number of people who only invest, only employ if they can get the profits and take those profits for themselves. What's the alternative? Well, as far as I'm concerned, what Marx would say is that socialism means, first of all, a class of society. So we wouldn't have class divisions between those who own all the means of production and the wealth, and those that have no wealth, no means of production, and only have their ability to sell their labor. That would be abolished. Everybody would be equal in the sense of there wouldn't be two classes, two major classes in society. Socialism means a class of society. And it means the end of private property on that basis. You'd have to have common ownership, where the society as a whole owns all the means of production and all the resources that are required in order to develop society and meet social needs. There'd be no state, there'd be no armed bodies of men engaged in warfare, engaged in suppression of the population. Instead, government would be organized to administrate in the best way, democratically, the resources and the plan required on the basis of common ownership. There'd be no oppression of women, of other sectors in society, race, of course, and religion as a result of a socialist society where classes are removed, and that perhaps religion would lose its influence over a period of time, but there would be no oppression of people who wanted to maintain their religion, wanted to maintain a national basis of their culture and so on. That would all be part of a society which would develop without classes. Ending private property would restore human freedom for the first time, which obviously doesn't exist in modern capitalism now in the 21st century. But of course, that society, a classless one, without markets, without money, without divisions in society, doesn't happen overnight. And it will require a transition towards communism through the political liberation of the working class. We need a democratic movement based on working class people to achieve control of finance and communications, public ownership of the key means of production, a progressive taxation system that ends these tax havens, these gains for the very, very rich. They would be billionaires, would not exist anymore. Public works and services would be developed rather than just the private interests of capitalism. The levelling up of incomes and free education, health, communications, and transport. That's a basic program for bringing about the change from capitalism to socialism. It can be started in one country, and of course it'll have to be spread to other countries if it's to succeed. So what we're talking about here as Marxists is ending, replacing this capitalist system and taking human development to a new higher stage. And rather than quote Marx, let me give you just a couple of quotes from Albert Einstein, one of the great socialists. If you didn't know, Einstein was a socialist, apart from being the greatest physicist we know. I'm convinced there's only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. The real purpose of socialism is precisely to overcome and advance beyond the predatory phase of human development. And another socialist, I'll finish on this little piece, is Oscar Wilde, who wrote a book called The Soul of Man Under Socialism, in which he says, with the abolition of private property, then we shall have true, beautiful, and healthy individualism. Nobody will be wasting his life accumulating things and symbols for things. One will live. Most of all, people will exist. That is all. An association of free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, and the happiness of individual inseparable from the happiness of all, to quote Marx. That is the target. That is the objective, it seems to me. We face at the moment all these terrible issues and conflicts developed by capitalism in the 21st century. But we mustn't lose sight of where we want to go to change society for the better.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. Really vividly bringing to life today some of Marx's key ideas and ways of thinking to help us understand the polycrisis, as you put it today, including the deepening climate crisis and the military crisis we see each day. I thought it was really helpful how, in detail, you set out as well the barbaric levels of poverty and inequality that capitalism brings to the world around us today, which are often highlighted for 1 or 2 days a year in the Oxfam report when it comes out and gets some press. And it's obviously a very valuable bit of work they do. But then I think it's almost forgotten about, even in our own circles, how awful poverty and inequality globally is. And also, I thought it was very important. And as we see hundreds of thousands of people signing up for Jeremy Corbyn's new initiative, for example, to state what a different future could be like, what a future based on people and planet, not profit, a socialist future could look like, and give people some hope. Before we move on to the questions, please, everyone watching, keep posting in the chat too. It's always amazing to see on all these Arise events people tuning in from so many different places. Always pleased to see our regular friends, in particular from Ireland, Norway, and Indonesia, who I noticed were amongst the first 10 people to buy their tickets for this Marx Matters series. And also in Britain, from people from all across the left, in all parties and none, and our movements here for these vital sessions of in depth socialist political education. Before I ask Michael some questions, I'm just going to quickly move over to one of the Arise Festival volunteers, Sian, for a few words on how you can get involved in the Marx Matters series and what's coming up.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Michael, for, as Matt said, I would completely concur. That was such a really clear, stark laying out of the situation in the world, and what is happening. And really, there's something very powerful and very valuable about carving out yourself a little time and space to think about what's happening in the world, to think about how we should approach it, to think about Marx's ideas, and to sort of help you direct that towards thinking about what's going on in the world and your activity and politics at the moment. And it's especially important in these sort of very tumultuous times. So the Marx Matters series exists to help you carve out just like a little time and space each month while it's going on, where you can sit down with a cup of tea and listen to a series of brilliant speakers and provoke your brain to think about these things. Our next event in the series is going to be on Sunday, the 5th of October, with Paula Blanc, from Marx to Lenin to today and tomorrow, which should, like today, be a fantastic event. And the best way of supporting the series and keeping it going and helping us to keep them sort of free and accessible to everyone is to, if you can, then to buy a ticket for the whole series. And that helps pay for things like the Zoom and the email infrastructure and all of that digital infrastructure that does cost money, unfortunately. So if you buy a ticket, if you can, definitely sign up for the next event with Paul in October. And for now, just relax and enjoy the Q&A section of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian, and thank you to everyone joining us. And also thank you to the Arise volunteers posting in the chat throughout the different sessions in this series. Please do always take a look at what's in the chat, as well as putting your own comments in there. So let's move over. We've got plenty of time left, which is good, to questions and discussion. First of all, I was going to ask a quick question of my own, linking to the current economic situation here in Britain particularly, but I think it has like global implications, which is, you did a very interesting chart about the falling profitability. And before that, you said how, as Marxists, we could talk about cycles of boom and slump. But could it be the case today that we're almost moving, at least here in Britain from the figures I see, but maybe in other countries as well, into a kind of period of, for want of a better term, permanent slump, or a permanent depression of some kind? Or is that exaggerating the situation?
Well, no, I think those who might know some of my works, I wrote a book in 2016 called The Long Depression, in which I argued that the major economies of the world had not really recovered from the Great Recession of 2008-9. And just to remind everybody, there was a big slump in the world after the global financial crash in 2008. And most economies in the world, the big economies, the major economies, dropped. Their national output actually fell, and their investment fell, and employment fell. It was probably the biggest slump in the history of capitalism in 2008-9. But instead of then recovering in a boom, like the boom and slump cycle I just mentioned in my introduction, what we saw afterwards in the 2010s was a growth rate which was for each of these economies much lower than it had been before 2008. Investment fell back. Everything was rather crawling along. It was depressed growth rate, really. So I call that period of 2010s a long depression. Before we came to the pandemic slump of 2020, which while only lasted about a year, was the even deeper slump, even more widely expansive than the Great Recession. So just to point out that in terms of national outputs, in terms of investment, and in terms of wages, that was the biggest crisis that capitalism has had so far in delivering what it's supposed to for the rest of the population around. So it lasted a short period of time. But since 2020, then we had a very nasty period of a sharp rise in inflation. People are still suffering from the probably 25-30% rise in prices on average in the shops and in utilities and so on that we buy to make our lives work, not just in Britain, but across the major economies. And it's only just in the last year or so that the inflation rate has slowed down, but it's still rising. It's still rising at around about 3% for most of the economies after going up 30%. So people's cost of living has dramatically risen, and their living standards have been stagnating as a result. So in a way, Matt is right. We're in a permanent stagnation now. It's not just in Britain. The United States is doing the best of the major economies, but it's only growing at 2%. It still has an inflation rate of around 3%. Its employment growth is now going down quite fast. When we come to Europe, Germany and France are basically in a state of total recession or stagnation at best. There's been no growth for 2 or 3 years, particularly in Germany, over the recent period since the end of the pandemic slump. So living standards are being squeezed to death in these major economies, including Britain. And Britain's economy is in a shocking state. We are going to get more about this over the next few months as we lead up to the Labour conference and other conferences, your party conference and so on, when it will become clear to activists in the movement and I hope to the wider population just how terrible the British economy is at the moment in terms of productivity growth, in terms of investment, in terms of the cost of living, in terms of interest rates and mortgage rates, and also inflation. The UK has the highest inflation rate of all the major economies now, close on 4% and still rising, way higher than elsewhere. And the situation is not going to improve. This is probably the worst situation that the British capitalist economy has been in probably since the 1930s, if not longer. So that gives you the indication of how the economies are going. Rather than say we've got not so much a slump, not so much stagnation, but we might call it stagflation. I don't know if you know, comrades, what that was back in the 1970s when I was a young man. Stagnation was stagnating economies, no growth in employment and investment in output, but we still had inflation, which was against all the theoretical ideas at the time. So you have stagnation and inflation. That's what we have now in Britain and increasingly in other countries. And that situation won't be resolved without a major economic crisis, which is still to come before the end of this decade, in my view.
That's really interesting. Sort of two things that we can come onto quickly, maybe before the next question, or I'll just feed in and we can see how it goes. But I think the depth of the crisis in Britain, to stay in Britain for a bit, as you mentioned, in terms of tasks and why Marx matters, I think something that we all need to get our heads around a bit in the movement, as this TUC week, then, and as you mentioned, a couple of weeks Labour week, then the budget in October or November as well, which I suspect in most areas will be a deep austerity budget, is that I don't think the situation is one where people I think more and more people, not necessarily just to the left, but don't see that tinkering with this system in Britain is going to dramatically change things. Like they don't think that small cosmetic changes or one or two good policies or initiatives in themselves will. People can see that the situation is quite, as you said, desperate economically, but also that situation, of course, feeding into the horrifying scenes we see outside hotels with refugees in on the one hand, or the climate, the crazy temperatures and other things that seem to be happening even in Britain with the climate, and of course the sort of live stream genocide that British arms are partly part of. It just seems to me that why we're talking about Marx Matters now is that we are in a particular, more sharp stage than perhaps some of us have been used to in recent years of political activity. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, or should we move on to the specific questions?
Just to add that you're absolutely right, Matt. I mean, we've just been through the hottest summer on record for the UK. Well, it's just weather. People say, well, okay, but every time the weather seems to be more extreme, we're no doubt going to get thunderous rain for 2 months or something to come up. But the extremes are developing in the weather. We're also getting extremes in political attitudes, aren't we? In the case of the UK, we're told by Reform and the people who run that organisation, but what's wrong with broken Britain, as they like to call it, is immigration. So apparently immigrants are causing all these problems in Britain, and there's no other issue. It's not what's wrong with the capitalist system and the way it's working, how it's failing to meet the needs of people in education, in housing, and in public services, and in benefits that people who can't work and will never be able to work for whatever reason need support. All those social safety nets, they cost money. Capitalism is not delivering on those. And as you say, Matt, what we'll get probably in the next few months, it's not a program to try and deal with that, which could change the system. We're getting a program from our politicians, both of the left and right, which basically means we have to pay. There'll be more cuts in public spending and benefits and so on, even worse. And the situation of inflation is continuing to rise. This is a rotten situation. It's nothing to do with immigration, really. Yes, it's difficult for Britain to look after the public services required for immigrants and refugees, but it's difficult for the British economy and the British government to look after anybody at the moment, not just immigrants. And that's the situation that we're in at the moment. And we shouldn't be diverted as we are, as the media is allowing it, is trying to make us divert towards just picking on some sections of the population who may not have actually been born here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think every weekend we see these horrifying scenes, and I would encourage everyone to support their local counter demonstrations and also the work Stand Up to Racism and others are doing. I'm going to move on from sort of Britain more to global, I suppose, perspective. The first audience question is one from someone called Ian from Cambridgeshire, who put this when they registered on Eventbrite in the comments section. And I noticed it on the back end of the Arise emails. And they asked, is it true that Marx and Engels predicted corporate globalization? And I guess that we could add to that a contemporary question, which is, with the era of Trump, is what we were like when I was at the London School of Economics, for example, what we were told was the era of globalization. Is that now coming to an end?
Well, there are two words there, corporate globalization. I'm not quite sure what the questioner exactly means. If he means that Marx and Engels thought that there will be an increasing concentration and centralization of companies and capital into the hands of a fewer and fewer number of people, that's clearly proved to be the case. Not just rich individuals like we see with the great tech moguls now, Musk and all the rest of them, but we're also talking about a huge concentration of companies and banks. It's been estimated by the Swiss Institute several years ago that there are probably just 143 companies in the world which have their shareholdings and interests into all the other companies in the world. And through their tentacles, they basically control all the investment and production decisions around the world. So that's the big energy giants, the big pharma companies, the banks, financial institutions. This small group of companies have a concentrated wealth and capital into their hands or their ability to influence it. And that was predicted. That would be the process that Marx and Engels thought would happen as capitalism, as the winners devoured the losers in the capitalist competition process, and we get an increasing concentration and monopolization. And what that meant, by the way, that with the profitability being squeezed for the losers so much, we saw an expansion of capital outside of national boundaries at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And we got this imperialist development where capital moved into the poor countries of the world to exploit labor there. And that's what we called in the latter mainstream economics called in the latter part of the 20th century globalization. I prefer the term imperialism because it implies that global movement of taking manufacturing industry away from the United States, from Europe, from Japan, and shifting it into Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, where cheap labor was available, was one of the big features of globalization in the second half of the 20th century, which enabled profitability across the world to rise a bit for capitalists for a while. But that's come to an end. We can see the figures. If we want to look at global trade relative to global output, then throughout the period from 1950 up until the first decade of the 21st century, there was a rise in that ratio of exports or trade to GDP. But since the end of the Great Recession, for the last 15, 20 years, that's flattened out or even fallen. And of course, now we have a new development where in America, the president sees his solution to America's difficulties, losing market share in all areas of the world, manufacturing and even in finance and in trade, is to introduce further measures to end globalization or free trade and the movement of free capital, and to concentrate it by introducing tariffs, protection measures, and other ways in which he hopes to make America great again at the expense of all the other countries. So globalization is definitely over. It's now taking the form not of free trade and free movement of capital, which was often damaging to the poor countries of the world, now to one of more of autarky, protectionism, and increasing conflict between nations. That's the future for the next 10 years, probably, as a result of these developments.
Thank you for that. I think obviously Saturday, September 6th, seeing another big demonstration for Palestine, and many people's activism is primarily focused on Palestine, and obviously the TUC as well, the ongoing divisions in the labour movement around issues around levels of military spending and welfare, not warfare, showed sort of how we can't avoid those questions that you're just talking about, even though some people might wish to. And I think linking back to what you've just said in terms of the global picture today, and another feature of the world in the era of Trump, and something that's obviously backed up by Keir Starmer and sadly some of his allies in the Labour movement here, of course, is and different comments always feed in on this, is this drive towards massive levels of military spending, which in Europe and Britain is about to go on to a complete another level in the next period, but around the whole world. And your chart illustrated so well growing conflict, and now we have more and more money being spent on the weapons that will be used and fuel future conflicts. A viewer asks, how can they, if they were in a discussion with other people in the movement, whatever, explain to people, it's going back to one of your slides a bit, I think, how can they explain to people how the war drive links directly to capitalism and the search for profit, rather than just that it's a bad person, like obviously Trump is a bad person, but how does the war drive link to what we're talking about more today, which is Marx understanding the capitalist world around us?
Well, one of the features of capitalism is the competition between the capitalist companies, but also within that, using their own base, their capitalist state, in order to develop their ability to expand their market share and get bigger profits at the expense of others. So, and the history of capitalism, particularly in the last 100 years, has also been the history of imperialism. So the richest countries with the biggest multinational companies and banks and the best technology have been able to exploit the poorest countries, which haven't had those advantages and haven't been able to develop their productive base in an effective way. And they've been reduced and held back as a result of that. So what we see is increasingly the big capitalist countries and the states behind them are looking to take advantage and improve their profits at the expense of others, particularly the poorer countries of the world. And they will do that not just by competition or trade barriers or just having the better technology and keeping it, but increasingly they're going to be doing it by using, and they always have done, to use armed violence if necessary in order to preserve their interests and their assets in these countries around the world. So we're seeing, take for example now, one of the big frightening things for American imperialism is that whereas it used to run the world ship without opposition, now it's increasingly getting rivalry from countries that no longer are prepared to just accept what American capitalists and companies want, whether it's the likes of India, whether it's the likes of Brazil, but of course in particular the likes of Russia and China. And China is the most worrying thing for American imperialism because it is catching up on technology, it's now the biggest manufacturing economy in the world. It has the biggest share of manufacturing exports. It's increasingly getting exports that are high tech. It's introducing all the new tech measures, that innovations which American companies have done, whether it's artificial intelligence, so on, the Chinese are there, electric cars, and so on. It could go on for some time. But the point is that China now is a real economic threat to the American economy. And what's the answer of the American economy, or the leaders of the American economy? It's not to compete in world markets, to invest more. No, it's try in some way in which they can strangle the ability of the Chinese economy to progress and the other countries who are resisting American imperialism as well. And that may well mean down the road more military conflict. In the case of Europe, we see that all the NATO is now going to expand its percentage of GDP in defense spending, so-called defense spending, military spending, from about 2% a year, 2% of GDP, to 5% by the end of this decade. That's a massive rise that we haven't seen since the 1950s, after the post-war period. And what is the purpose of this? The purpose of this, presumably, is to provide a huge, great military force, which they see as being able to strangle or oppose Russia in Europe, and of course China in Asia, enemies of Western democracy and of the American US-led imperialism around the world. So that's the direction we're going on. And let's think about it. If you're going to spend an increase of 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP over the next 5 years, that's 3% of GDP just going to military spending, when economies like Britain are running deficits on their government of something like 5 or 6% of GDP. And that's going to only make that situation worse. And yet we're told by the current Labour government in Britain and by every other government in Europe that they've got to keep their spending down. How are they going to do that if they're going to increase defence spending to that level? There's only one way: cut benefits, cut public services, increase taxes on ordinary people. That's the direction we're going in, not just back to austerity, but a real squeeze on the average living standards of working people in Europe, in Japan, and in North America.
Yes, and I think that last point is really important. In terms of some of the other work Arise will be doing in the next period, I think is about trying to hammer out economic alternatives and the kind of things we should be demanding. And I think sometimes thinking about the big picture actually helps with that more. And of course, we should be calling for taxing the rich and expanding public ownership and control, but also we do need to be putting that welfare, not warfare line into these discussions, because if the left doesn't do it, then that is, I think, taking a good argument away from us when we want to expose the sort of pro-capitalist politicians for saying there is no money, while at the same time spending more and more money on nuclear weapons and so on. Before we go to closing remarks, for another question, something that I said in one of the articles promoting this series and the Lenin one was that I felt that more and more young people in particular were seeing the links between the news of record profits and inequality they read in the paper, the wars they see on the TV, and the restrictions on their rights and civil liberties here. And something that one of our viewers from Ireland always rightly raises on all these more theoretical or political education sessions, I suppose you could say that we do, is the need to understand the role of the state. And that was something that you sort of came on to towards the end of the presentation, what Marx and, of course, Engels wrote on this as well, said about the role of the state under capitalism. And I suppose my point is we're seeing that this massive expansion of Trump sort of putting the police into these various areas in the states that we've seen in recent months, plus the attacks on Palestine groups, climate groups before that, and others on our right to protest here. How does what Marx said matter when it comes to understanding the role of the state in capitalism today?
Well, I think when we have the word state, people think of government, they think of civil servants, they think of politicians. But what Marx and Engels said, don't just think of those. That's just the surface. What's the state really is, he called it bodies of armed men. So it's the police force, it's the armed forces, it's the secret services, it's these areas which are being used not to administer and improve the conditions of working people in any country and keep crime down and all that sort of thing. Crime levels don't seem to play much role as far as the police and the armed forces are concerned. They're not being used in that direction. These forces are there to ensure that the capitalist system is maintained and sustained against any opposition. So if there's a sufficient protest, a sufficient movement against the capitalist system, then these forces are in the background ready to be used against working people and their democratic movement towards changing society. So I tell viewers that we must be building an organization, a movement that can achieve, that adopts a socialist program, adopts a way forward to achieve socialism, to stand in elections, to try and get a majority in the existing democratic organizations that we have. But don't expect the state to accept that if it comes to the crunch. The state is not politicians, it's not civil servants. Of course, it's partly that, but it's primarily these bodies of armed men, which will be used against working people if it comes to the point where they fear the end of the capitalist system. That's one of the lessons that Marx and Engels presented when they presented the question of the state. So that when we move to socialism, we would do away with this unbelievably grotesque process by which people are suppressed and controlled by bodies of armed men that would no longer exist as socialism develops throughout the world and everybody's involved in organizing society in the interests of everybody, for the many rather than the few.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point for contemporary discussion, and obviously we have examples in history of the ruling class demonizing and undermining left governments. Allende in Chile, the most famous one, and one that, of course, this week will be the anniversary of the other September the 11th, as some people term it. But also, we think we saw, like a last thought for me on this element, we saw a bit of it when Corbyn was the Labour Party leader in terms of the amazing level of media misrepresentation and hostility. And as someone who was quite centrally involved with that at different points, it's quite it's quite hard now looking back on it to see, like, what was it, for 10 years ago, for a period of 4 or 5 years. It's quite amazing how much it sort of became normalized even in your own head as an activist, this level of intense misrepresentation and slander and all the other words you want to put on it, which is just one reflection of that ruling class hostility to a better future.
Matt, it's a lesson for us all, because if we build a left movement again, which has a chance of winning over the population, the media will be used in this direction, exactly the same way as the Corbyn Labour Party leadership was attacked between 2015 and 2019.
So before I give Michael the final word for today, I'm just going to ask you, after my next bit, Michael, to sum up in a very short way why Marx matters, like the key things from our discussion, which is not an easy challenge, but I'll give you that challenge with no notice right now. But before we go over to our good comrade Michael for that, just a reminder to everyone again to grab a ticket for the whole Marx series, a Marx Matters series. I know that when some people say on the call, why do you keep making these announcements asking us to buy tickets or give donations? But it really is the case that we are all volunteers. There are different people you see popping up on these screens: Fraser, who a lot of you know, Sean, Neve, the multiple Bens. All these people are volunteers, but we do have costs because Zoom costs hundreds of pounds a year, Eventbrite costs money a year, MailChimp costs money a year. When we have meetings that even in really reasonably priced venues like the ones we used for the Rise Festival this year, they still cost money. We're at the TUC this week for 2 events, Labour for at least 3 events. They all cost money. So please do donate when you can, but especially when it comes to this series, buy a ticket for the series. That's the best way to help. Also, please now put in your diaries on screen the announced events in this series for the rest of the year. So this series will go on beyond 2025, but we now have the full programme for 2025. And to sum up what they are quickly, we're live with Paula Blank in October on From Marx to Lenin to Today and Tomorrow. In November, we've got Radhika Desai on Marx and multipolarism. And then in December, we've got another good friend of the Rise Festival, Jim McVeigh from the Connolly Centre in the north of Ireland, who'll be talking on Marx, Ireland, and lessons for our struggle today. That's in December. Then we'll be back next year where we've already got sessions underway. And please do send in as ticket holders your suggestions for topics as well. We've got people like Oslim Onaran, John Trickett MP, and Grace Blakely confirmed to be doing talks next year. So that's people from all different bits of the left, and there'll be interesting talks as well. Before I go back over to Michael, just a thank you to Ben, who's our tech volunteer, who records things for us, clips things for us, streams things live for us. It's much appreciated. And especially, of course, to everyone for tuning in. And now over to you, Michael, for any final comments.
Well, I only have one important thing, I think, to say to everybody, Matt, and the viewers, is that what Marx and Engels are presenting as a critique of capitalism is that we're talking about word capitalism, that we have a system of production and investment, employment, and meeting people's needs only through private ownership of the means of production. That's the factories, the offices, patents, the knowledge material, the raw materials. All that is owned by a group of capitalists, companies, but particularly quite a small group of capitalists and companies. And they decide our lives. They decide investment. They decide employment. They decide how much goes towards public services. And if it's too much, they fight against it. They try to reduce it. These people control the system we have. It's a system of production for profit, a system of investment in resources for profit. If there's no profit, then these things are not produced in the interest of the majority of the population. That's the contradiction. That's the fundamental thing that Marx and Engels are saying. We need a system where things are produced to meet social needs, not to meet the private profit interests of just a small group of people and the companies and means of production that they own. And so we need a system of common ownership, a planned system where everybody works democratically to meet the needs of the population through planning the investment and resources that we do have, not leaving it to a small group or clique or class of owners of capital that we have at the moment. And if we don't do that, if we don't change it, then this system will continue to creak and cause all the things that I've described in the introduction in this polycrisis that the 21st century has entered in terms of inequality, crises in production, climate change, and growing conflict and wars around the world. That's what we have to change.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll see you next time in October in this Marx Matters series. Thank you.